Hello, students. This is Alan Gilmore with Human Services 20, Introduction to Social Work. And we are moving into Modular 6, Social Work Practice with Agencies and Communities. So that's our focus for this week. The question that we hope we're going to be able to answer by the time we get to the end of this presentation is, why is it important for social workers to engage with community agencies and organizations? And there's a variety of different reasons that I think will become more clear as we make our way through the PowerPoint. Community practice is defined as any activity that is engaged in by social workers that's designed to improve conditions in a community. So in this situation, we are looking at something broader than just an individual, a couple, a family, or a group. Now we're really talking about social work efforts that try to address an entire community. Generalist community practice work can include efforts with agencies and communities. And in fact, obviously you can't do community social work without engaging and participating with partnering agencies or organizations and community members. Successful social work intervention often requires the social worker to engage community agencies and organizations in the process. And we're going to talk more about that, but it's important that early on in any efforts around community change or community practice, that you're identifying where your allies are at, who is it that will be able to participate and contribute to the effort that you're trying to move forward on. And that's going to be a part of your discussion board for this week as well. So again, make sure that you're really thinking about, gee, if I wanted to get a new park established in my community, who would be the other organizations or agencies that I would want to have on board that might be able to address some aspects of the effort that I don't have the capability of being able to do, or my agency doesn't have the capability of being able to do. You really want to identify where those allies and partners exist. And it's important to make sure that all the stakeholders are all participating at all levels of the process. So in any community, you want to be looking at the schools, you want to be looking at the churches, you want to be looking at other social service organizations that might exist within that community. You want to be looking at local community government. So if you're working in a smaller community or even in a city as large as Fresno, you'd want to find out who is the representative on the city council that represents the area of the neighborhood that I'm looking to work in. And so those are all going to be your stakeholders, the people that you want to have involved, informed. You want to be educating them so they can be a resource to be speaking about the project that you're trying to move forward out in the community as well. And if it's coming to an actual ordinance or something that's going to have to be officially sanctioned, you're going to want political representation, because they're going to be voting on it and they're going to be able to influence the other members of either the city council or the board of supervisors, or if you're talking about state legislature, or all the way up to the federal government. You're looking for those partners and allies who can help advance your issue. And I might say you're also looking for informal community leaders. And informal community leaders are different in different communities. It might be a local business owner. It could be the mom who spearheads the PTA at school. It's that person who's not elected or appointed. It could be the local law enforcement staff that are working in that particular neighborhood, depending on what the perception is of law enforcement in that particular neighborhood. But there are those that are formal community leaders, but you're also looking for those informal community leaders. Community work can use the plan change model as is used with casework. So what we talked about last week in terms of all of those elements and all of those processes that you use in terms of the plan change model, you can use that same model in terms of working in communities. The bottom line is, in community work, the client that you're working with is the community. And so as long as you're continuing to keep that in your focus, I think it'll help you understand how you can use any of the systems that we use with individuals, couples, families, or groups, and be able to apply it to a community setting. Community change, social welfare policies, and agency administration must be based on solid research. So there is very clear and very well delineated research on how you do community social work. And so it's important to begin to become familiar with those resources. Funding sources, including legislative bodies, are increasingly demanding agency accountability for any funding that they provide. So much of what happens in terms of community work is often substantiated or supported financially through grants, whether they be federal, state, or local grants. And there has to be a good system for accountability. How was the money spent? What were the goals that were proposed at the time that the funding was initially provided? Were those goals achieved? It'll even come down to, objectives and the way that objectives within a work plan might be written. So if somebody gives you, funds to be able to go out and do, to educate community members about how important it is to have new parks in the community, and you say in your work plan that you are going to hold 25 community meetings, and a year later you've held 2 community meetings, the likelihood of you getting funded from that particular funding source again is probably going to be highly unlikely. So those are the kind of things that we mean when we're talking about agency accountability. Assistance to individuals and families can often be more effective if changes are made at the community or societal level rather than on a case-by-case basis. So if there's a condition or a situation in your community that really is not in the best interest of the people who live in that particular area, and initially it's that you're simply trying to address it one case at a time, obviously you're going to have much more significant impact if you're able to make a community level change so that you're not having to address the same thing repeatedly over and over and over again. But now you've made that change, and now it's going to impact and have an influence over the entire community and everyone involved. So let's define communities. Communities can be defined as a group of individuals who usually live near each other, may share a common environment, including public and private resources, and identify themselves with that community. So we need to think in a very, very broad terms in terms of community. So while we can often be talking about a geographic or territorial community, places that have clearly defined geographic and political boundaries. So you're talking about the city of Fresno, the city of Clovis, the city of Reedley. But you could also be talking about communities of identification and interests. These are communities that are formed around shared concerns, beliefs, and values that sometimes bring them into conflict with other communities. So examples are communities that might be based on ethnicity, race, religion, lifestyle, sexual orientation, or profession. So in a lot of communities, you may be able to identify a part of the community that is identified with a particular ethnicity. I think the one that most folks are somewhat familiar with is many communities will have something that's referred to as Chinatown, or a place where there's a predominantly large Chinese population that's residing there. You'll go there, you'll find Chinese businesses, you'll find Chinese products, you'll find people who are living there that ancestry dates back to China. That would be an example of a community based on ethnicity. Now, they may also all be residents of, say, San Francisco, but they may identify themselves more as being residents of Chinatown than necessarily as being residents of San Francisco. You certainly have also seen, in terms of lifestyle or sexual orientation, there are, in more larger communities, areas of a particular community where there is a predominantly large gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender population that's residing there. So if you talk about something like West Hollywood in Los Angeles, or the Castro in San Francisco, and some would even possibly argue, the Tower District in Fresno. Those would all be communities of identification and interest based on sexual orientation. Traditional communities is another way to be thinking about communities. This is often defined as communities where members maintain their separateness, their uniqueness, their cultural integrity, and historical identity. So this could be, for instance, an Amish community, so based on religion. It could be Native American community, based on ethnicity. It could be Hasidic Jews. They're a combination of both ethnicity and religion. So those are all traditional communities, and the rationale or the reasoning for why they identify themselves as a community is that they have a high investment in maintaining their cultural integrity and historical identity. Communities of diversity are a group of individuals made up of members of marginalized groups who often struggle to navigate within an economically depressive, discriminatory environment. So we've all heard terms like ghetto or barrio. Some would reference reservations, rancherias. These are all communities of diversity where you often have people who are residing together or identify themselves as a community based on having a long struggle of economics and a long struggle regarding discrimination. So finally, just to make sure that we're clear on this, communities may be defined as spaces. So it could be a city or a subunit of a city, could be interests. So it could be a religious community, and it could be identification, an ethnic community that people share with others in location specific. So in other words, we all live in the same physical location, but you can also have a sense of community and not necessarily live in close proximity. So that would be non-location specific individuals and groups. So social workers' roles in communities, the same basic skills, those micro skills, so working with individuals, couples, families, and groups that are necessary to work effectively with people, are also used in community work, or what's referred to as macro work or practice with communities. Generalist social workers engage in community practice, and they play the same roles as those who work with individuals, families, and groups. Social work with communities may encompass a wide range of problems and issues, and you'll see that in your discussion board assignment when you get to that today, or whenever you get to it. And then finally, generalist social workers are constantly engaging in community practice as they work with various organizations to address specific needs of their clients. So we've had a couple of opportunities to take a look at all the various kinds of roles that social workers can play, both in the micro as well as the macro arena. And so again, this is probably a list that looks somewhat familiar to you from some past discussions and some past assignments. But these are all roles that a social worker who's working within a community practice setting could possibly adopt. So we've got within community practice, just as we have within micro practice or practice with individuals, groups, families, and couples, these things that we identify as practice models and approaches. So social workers engage in a variety of community practice approaches. And here's the list. And we're going to now proceed and take a look at each of these individually. So the first one is neighborhood and community organizing. And the approach here is to develop the capacity of community members to organize around quality of life issues in their communities. So to go back to an earlier example, if there were a group of community members or neighborhood members that all identified that there are not enough parks in their neighborhood, a social worker may be working with them in terms of developing their capacity to organize around that particular issue. It's a combination of both education and encouragement. So if somebody's never worked with a city council or doesn't know how you can get a new park started, then the social worker's role may be to serve as an educator, but then they may also serve as an organizer. They may also help draft, this is what a petition should look like. And so if you want to go out and collect signatures, those kinds of things. Organizing communities for action. The scope of concern is advocacy for a specific issue or population. So an example here is a living wage for women or resources for the homeless. So this is a role that a community-based social worker would play where there's a particular focus on a particular issue or population. Community, social, and economic development. Prepare citizens to use social and economic investments to address issues of income inequality, housing resources, and social support resources. So if those were the areas that were being identified and that there was a strong need for in the community, then a social worker who's working around community, social, and economic development would be working with residents and be working with government officials and other partners in the community to try to address issues around income inequality. It could have something to do with the availability of jobs. It could have something to do with a living wage. You might be looking at housing resources. You might be looking at mixed use neighborhoods. So how can you advocate for that and try to move those kinds of efforts forward? So those would all be examples of community, social, and economic development. Social planning, the goal here is the integration of social needs into planning in the public arena. Strategies include working behind the scenes with others to advance a specific proposal for action, directly participating in the planning, and influencing people who participate in the planning. So it's important for community members, it's important for social workers, other community leaders, to really be there at the very beginning. So again, maybe going back to our example of new parks in a particular neighborhood or a part of the city, it becomes really important that residents are involved at the very, very beginning when they're starting to talk about what's this park going to look like? What neighborhood are we going to position it in? Where is the available land for it? What are going to be the amenities? Are we going to have tennis courts or swings, or what is it? How is it going to be used, and what is going to be contained in the park? So rather than residents coming in at the tail end, it becomes important for planners and city engineers that work around these particular kinds of efforts to involve the public from the very beginning. Program development and serving as community liaisons. With this particular practice model, the desired outcome of program development and serving as liaisons is expansion or redirection of agency programs and services. This is something that often happens with an organization that maybe for a period of time has been providing one type of service or has been providing a particular service in a particular way. And they're starting to get a sense, or the community is maybe even helping them identify that the way they've done it in the past doesn't work anymore. Maybe there's been an emergence of a new population that needs this service and those folks are not accessing it. Maybe there's something where there's a program that traditionally has been directed to one population, but now it's being also directed to a second population, but the staff that are moving the program forward don't speak the language of the second population. That would be an issue of really kind of taking a step back and reevaluating the program and how it can be improved upon. Political and social action efforts focuses on social justice by changing policy or policymakers. The goal is to build political power and institute change. So, excuse me. So this is where social work starts to overlap with politics, because when you're talking about changing policymakers, you're talking about trying to elect somebody new to replace somebody who you feel is not in tune with the way that you want to see your community or your neighborhood move forward. So, so that's exactly what that is, political and social action efforts. Coalition building, the goal is to create a multi-organizational power base large enough to influence program direction or secure resources, often related to a specific issue related to a social need or concern. There is definitely power in numbers. And so the more diversity that you can bring to a coalition, the more numbers, the more representation. When we've worked on coalition building, we've thought about things like that we want to have, if we're trying to make changes in the area that I work in, which is the city of Madera, or the county of Madera. But if we're focusing on an issue specific to the city, we want to make sure that there's somebody on our coalition that represents each of the voting districts that the city is divided into. So that way, when we go to a city council meeting and start to advocate about a particular issue and our coalition members go with us, the elected representatives are able to look out into the audience and see, oh, I know him, he votes in my district. And that will make a significant difference in terms of coalition building. Coalition building, it's important to include youth. It's important to include people of color. It's important to include everybody who could potentially be a representative within that community. And finally, social movements. The goal here is social justice within a society. There are many, many, many examples, and there's many that are going on right now. But some past examples include welfare rights movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the gay rights movement, immigrant rights movement, and the feminist movement. So again, this is, it can be at a local level, it can be at a national level, but it really is about a focus on social justice. So we are going to end our first video here. And when we come back, we'll start talking about community organizing.